Hello, everyone. Welcome to another class of your Women in Gender Studies class. I'm your professor, Dr. Maldonado. Let's get started. This week, we'll be examining human rights and global activism. So we're going to start out with human trafficking because that is definitely one of the major human rights issues. So human trafficking is the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by the threat or use of force, abduction, fraud, deception, abuse of power, or payment to another person for the purposes of exploitation. Many people often confuse human trafficking with being sex trafficking. Although sex trafficking is a form of human trafficking, the two are not synonymous with one another. So human trafficking comes in many forms. We have commercial sexual exploitation, such as sex trafficking, forced labor, and bonded labor. Now let's go through each. Commercial sexual exploitation. This is trafficking for sexual exploitation. So this accounts for more than half of all sex trafficking victims. Forced labor. Victims are forced to work as domestic servants, agricultural workers, factory workers, mine workers, restaurant waitstaff, construction workers, and more. Those who are trafficked for forced labor account for 40% of all trafficking victims. Now we have bonded labor. Now, this is a never-ending cycle of repaying a fabricated debt by performing labor. For example, if you have a woman who was stolen from her home and she is contracted to perform any type of trafficking labor, such as sex labor or forced labor, then she is told often that you have to pay off a certain figure. Let's say that this figure is $2,000. So she works for 5 years to pay off this $2,000. However, the cycle is never ending because at the end of that 5 years, once she pays off the $2,000, her trafficker will simply tell her, you have to pay off the housing that I provided you for the past 5 years. You have to pay off the meals that I provided you for the past 5 years. You also have to pay off all the costs associated with clothing, healthcare, etc., that I provided you for the last 5 years. So you are not actually done. You still have to work. And this lie will be told over and over again to this trafficked person. True or false? Human trafficking is predominantly a problem in developing countries. This is actually false. Human trafficking is worldwide, and it affects nearly every country and every region. 70% of victims are women and girls. 1 in 3 victims are children. So, who are the traffickers? Traffickers range from individuals to organized crime groups, and 75% of convicted traffickers are men. Now, what's the motivation for trafficking? Profit in order to make money. Billions of dollars are reaped by recruiters, agents, buyers, and sellers of trafficked humans, police and border control officials, and government officials. It is a mistake to believe that trafficking is done in the dark, that is done in secret. Unfortunately, trafficking is so pervasive, it's all around us. Sometimes we're even looking at trafficked individuals who we're just having casual conversations with. However, they're sworn to secrecy or threatened for secrecy, and they're unable to tell you their story of how they've been trafficked. So when it comes to human trafficking, everyone's involved. Everyone, as in your officials, they are involved in trafficking because who controls the borders? Who controls law and legislation that requires people with titles, people who are in positions of authority and respect to be involved? So there are global trends in trafficking. We have particular regions that we're going to pay attention to, such as South Asia, East Asia, and the Pacific, Africa and the Middle East, Europe and Central Asia, and the Americas. Now, these regions are grouped together specifically because they share similar commonalities as to why and who they traffic people for. So South Asia, East Asia, and Pacific. These regions primarily traffic adults for forced labor. Africa and the Middle East primarily traffic boys for armed combat and primarily traffic girls and women for forced labor. Europe and Central Asia primarily traffics adult women for sexual exploitation and also forced marriages. In the Americas, adults are primarily trafficked for forced labor and sexual exploitation. Now, I want you to look at the common theme of forced labor. When it comes to forced labor, think about the capitalistic systems that are pervasive within colonized societies. When you have capitalistic systems that are designed to maximize profit and minimize costs, of course, you're maximizing all the profit that you can by not having to pay an individual for performing labor. So if a human is threatened or even stolen to perform free labor, i.e., forced labor or bonded labor, then of course that trafficker or that owner of that business is taking in all the profit without having to pay the individual who's performing labor a wage or a salary because they're not employees, they are trafficked individuals. So this is a video about Tony D. Rivera, and she was once a trafficking victim. But now we tend to say trafficking survivors or any survivor of any type of violence or assault. So once a victim herself, she was then turned into a trafficker. And she tells the details of her story of how she managed to traffic other people, including children, and also got out of trafficking as well. And now she's an advocate to warn all people against trafficking and how and what it looks like. So I want you to watch this video on your own time. And think about these questions as you're watching this video. Is physical violence or kidnapping necessary to recruit or trick people into trafficking? What are some precautions that one can take to prevent being trafficked? How can we work together as a society to stop and prevent human trafficking? And any additional thoughts you may have on a video. So let's go through these questions one by one. Is physical violence or kidnapping necessary to recruit or trick people into trafficking? No. Often people are trafficked not merely by being snatched out of their beds, even though that does happen, or snatched off of the street. That does happen. But often people are persuaded or tricked into going to a party to hang out with mutual friends. And then something happens at that party to where they become unconscious, right? Such as they were being drugged or anything like that. And then they wake up in the back of a van or they wake up in the back of a building tied up or unconscious. You can't wake up unconscious, but you are coming awake from being unconscious. And other precarious scenarios, right? That's often how it happens. You're told one thing, and then once you're in that environment, another thing happens. So you don't necessarily have to be kidnapped or be physically assaulted in order to be trafficked. What are some precautions that one can take to prevent being trafficked? Make sure to stay vigilant, be aware, and don't be too trusting. If you see something, say something, because you may just be saving someone's life. Also, make sure to hold your loved ones accountable as well, including your friends, because even your friends can operate to trick you into trafficking as well. How can we work as a society to stop and prevent human trafficking? Make sure to implement policies to deter trafficking. Investigate the issue promptly. Don't hold off or wait or try to ignore the issue. And also make sure to impose harsh public penalties to deter anyone else from engaging in any sort of human trafficking. And once you complete your learning assessments, I'll be very, very intrigued to see what other thoughts that you have on this issue. True or false? Access to clean drinking water is a growing concern around the world, and this growing deficit contributes to rising water costs. That is true. So we're moving on from human trafficking to discussing the relationship between water and also gender. Because considering that our world, our bodies are roughly 70, 90% water, depending upon which entity that you're talking about, we need water in order to survive. So water is a critical part of the conversation when it comes to talking about the environment, human rights issues, and also gender-related issues, because they're all interconnected. So in 2016, 15 million people in the United States experienced water termination due to unaffordability. That is a huge issue. You need water to cook, you need water to clean, you need water to bathe, you need water to stay hydrated. So access to water is critically important and is a human rights matter. So what's the connection between gender and water? Water is central to domestic labor, such as preparing food, bathing, laundry, and watering of gardens and animals, etc. Girls and women are socialized around the world to tend to the home and perform domestic labor in relation to boys and men. Remember that boys and men are socially is normalized, socially constructed, and also socialized to work outside of the home. Last point, gender connects to water in that girls and women are primarily responsible for securing access to water to perform domestic chores. So, even though women are largely responsible for securing access to water and the use of it to facilitate domestic labor, men are often responsible for the management of water, such as being engineers, ditch diggers, water sanitizers, farmers, urban planners, and etc. So both genders within the binary work with water, albeit in different ways. So now we move on to cultural and religious norms when it comes to genital cutting. What do we mean by genital cutting? Have you ever heard of this phrase before? Genital cutting refers to the removal and or modification of genital skin, or partial or complete removal, modification of genital organs. So for the first point, you can think about circumcision. You can also think about circumcision in both genders within the binary, men, women. Also think about those with an ambiguous mixture of reproductive organs, whether it's internal or external. But for the sake of clarity and simplicity, let's refer to external reproductive organs. So think about the cutting of the foreskin in males, and also the cutting of the foreskin in females as well. Females have foreskin, human females, on their clitori. It covers the clitoris because remember what we spoke about earlier. The clitoris and the penis are the exact same erectile tissue. They both can engorge with blood and they both can become erect. And they're both designed for sexual pleasure. So when it comes to removing or modifying the genital skin, when it comes to doing that, there's definitely going to be an alteration of sexual pleasure and sensitivity. So when it comes to partial or complete removal modification of genital organs, of course, that could completely elide or erase sexual sensitivity because the organs are missing. The organs are gone. So let's go into more detail here. So here are some details and examples of genital cutting. Circumcision of penises and clitori by cutting and removing the foreskin and clitoral hood, respectively. It also includes genital cosmetic surgeries, such as having designer vaginas, even though, remember, vagina refers to the vaginal canal that's inside of the body, not the outside vulvar structure. The outside vulvar structure of female genitalia is referred to as the vulva. That incorporates the labia majora, the labia minora, the clitoris, and the mons pubis. All right. So when it comes to sewing the vulvar labia, the majora and the minora, or the vaginal opening, such as the introitus, closed. Okay. Multiple options are possible here. So with the minora, those are the smaller lips or folds that are on the vulva. So the minora, in comparison to the majora, does not grow hair. The majora is the part, the lips, the folds that can grow hair. So when someone undergoes genital cutting, their minora can be sewed together, and or their majora can also be sewn together in order to discourage premarital intercourse. The vaginal opening, which is called the introitus, can also be sewn closed, with leaving a little hole or a little opening to allow menstrual blood to flow through. And you may ask, well, if the minora and the majora are sewn closed, how is urine released? Again, there's a small opening or hole that's left open in order for the urine and the menstrual blood to flow out. However, that opening will not compensate any type of penetration. So, genital cutting can also include the amputation or searing off of the clitoris, total removal. And this is to, again, discourage premarital sexual activity and also to promote sexual chastity in girls. So let's go through some details here. With the circumcision of penises or clitori, by cutting and removing the foreskin and clitoral hood, this is often a practice of religion, which promotes chastity or signaling of the arrival of adulthood. These types of circumcisions are also a practice of health considerations, such as a routine procedure to ward off bacteria and or other STIs. So even though this health consideration does have evidence to support, oh, if you are circumcised, you have better hygiene. However, by simply pulling back the foreskin and using soap and water to clean under the area or within the area, that's how you can practice hygiene as well, because those same practices are also encouraged for circumcised individuals. When it comes to genital cosmetic surgeries, we refer to this as vaginoplasty, which is the reduction of clitoral size or the tightening of the vaginal canal or any other operations that will go under the umbrella term of vaginoplasty. Labiaplasty, that's the removal of labia, either or and or the majora or minora to conform to achieve genital conformity. And this is in quotes, or at least should be in quotes, because oftentimes there's this westernized idea of what's considered a desirable appearance of a vulva, which is having small or non-existent majora or minora. That's an ideology that many Western societies have. So sewing the vulvar labia and or the vaginal opening closed, this often signifies passage into womanhood. Also embraces and emphasizes social acceptance among one's community. And this action is also done to prevent unwedded sex, which doesn't work when it comes to sexual violence. Often if girls and or women are sexually violated where penetration is involved and they were circumcised, then their minora and or majora are simply resewn closed in order to hope, quote unquote, hope that she will marry later. Oftentimes it's not uncommon for a rapist or a sexual violator to marry the violated girl or violated woman. And lastly, amputating or searing off the clitoris operates to discourage unwedded sexual activity. So what are the implications of genital cutting? We talked about a couple of implications already when it came to sexual sensitivity being obliterated. So here are some implications. Infants cannot consent. Risk of permanent loss or some or all sexual sensation and sensitivity, pain during intercourse, decreased sexual desire, and lessened sexual satisfaction, scarring, dryness, and infection of genitals, obstructed menstruation, recurrent bladder and urinary tract infections, increased vulnerability to HIV/AIDS, infertility, and increased risk of childbirth complications. Now you may ask, how does genital cutting have a correlation with vulnerability to HIV/AIDS? Well, if you have open wounds in an area where someone's infected sperm or infected bodily fluids can enter those open wounds, then that can increase the chances of HIV/AIDS. So, what are some implications of genital cutting when it comes to the broader picture? Gender-conforming surgeries are often performed without parents' knowledge and/or consent to standardize the appearance of intersex babies' genitals. That happens. Many babies who are born intersex, doctors, some doctors, will often perform these surgeries on these babies in order to make their genitalia appear more like a penis or appear more like a vulva and not disclose the surgery to the parents. Or they may, and the parents consent to the surgery, and the child may never know. Some children are informed that they were born intersex, but not all the time. The American Academy of Pediatrics acknowledges potential health benefits, but articulates that the benefits do not warrant routine genital cutting. And when we're talking about health benefits, we're talking about assembly hygiene here. So remember, no country is free from human rights abuses. None. The UN Convention of the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW. This has implications. So, first, Human Rights Treaty to comprehensively address women's rights. We can give that accolade to CEDAW. This was the first human rights treaty to address women's rights. CEDAW also asserts that there needs to be a change in the roles of men, women, and the family in order to achieve institutional equity and equality. However, even though CEDAW was pioneering and revolutionary, it still has not been ratified by a handful of countries, including the United States of America. Okay? So remember, the UN, that's the United Nations, that encompasses mostly all countries around the world. However, the United States is against ratifying CEDAW. So here are the reasons that the United States has quarrel with CEDAW. The United States says that this international law will serve as imposing another entity's views upon American politics. And America, like the United States, likes to have the reputation of, oh, we're independent and free thinking. So we want to make up our own laws and own rules and not be subject to international law. Also, officials in the United States argue that we already have guarantees to some major provisions of CEDAW. However, those guarantees are not always guaranteed. They may be written down on paper, but are they fully executed? And so these guarantees, quote unquote, still fall short for women of color, pay gaps, and other systemic issues within this country. So CEDAW falls short by not addressing gender-based violence against women. Also, ratifying governments do not uphold parts of the treaty. This goes into what we discussed before, with something having been written down, but is it followed and executed? Such as not upholding these specific parts: women's rights within marriage, roots of discrimination experienced by women globally. Think about the roots that we examined in the privilege, oppression, and discrimination map. White supremacist ideologies, patriarchy, and cis heteronormativity. Equal and equitable access to property rights and inheritance rights for women. Okay. Men have these rights, but not so much women, especially around the world. And CEDAW is also silent on abortion rights and rights for lesbians and transgender folks. Okay. So even though CEDAW is revolutionary and pioneering, particularly for women and minority groups, other minority groups, this is where CEDAW falls short. And of course, that's where you all come in as the leaders of tomorrow in order to help fortify institutions like CEDAW in order to be brought into life. So that is the end of our lecture for this week. Thank you so much for your time and attention.